Hi, I'm Dr. Jim Zoval, a professor of chemistry at Saddleback College. You're about to watch one of my video lectures. If you like this lecture, you can get the entire Allied Health General Organic and Biochemistry course from the website address you see on the screen right now. Be sure to type the underscore between VOD and pages in this address. Enjoy the video. We're going to start the biochemistry now. I think you guys will really enjoy these next 5 chapters, especially in lieu of your recent learning or recollection of the general and organic chemistry chapters that we did. We're going to talk about carbohydrates now. Carbohydrates are also known as sugars.
Sugar. Honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Honey, oh sugar, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you.
Carbohydrates, an abundant biomolecule. We find them all over the place in nature. In organic compounds that occur in nature, 50% of the carbon occurs in carbohydrates. What's keeping these huge trees from blowing over in the wind is a huge amount of carbohydrates, a lot of cellulose that provides structure. We'll talk about how that happens later on in this chapter. Why are there so many carbohydrates in nature? It's because nature produces them. Plants use photosynthesis to store energy and glucose. Plants get water and CO2 and energy from the sun. This reaction wouldn't be spontaneous. It needs energy to drive it. It gets that from the sun. And it converts these molecules into these 2 molecules, O2 and glucose. Plants then bind a bunch of glucose molecules together and store that energy in a molecule called starch. We'll learn about those chemical reactions in this chapter. What is a carbohydrate? Here's our definition of a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are large class, naturally occurring polyhydroxy aldehydes and ketones. You know, you'll have a lot of people, self-appointed nutrition experts. They are a nutrition expert because they proclaim themselves to be one. Some people actually have degrees in them, but most people who give you nutritional advice may have limited backgrounds in chemistry, in nutrition, in science, and scientific method. They'll say carbohydrates are, quote, bad, or carbohydrates are good, or something like this. And so, you know, most of them, I doubt, would really know the technical chemical definition of what a carbohydrate is. They might say something like, well, it's bread, or it's, you know, rice and grains and things like that. If you ask them, try it next time, they say, oh, carbohydrates are really bad for you. You shouldn't eat a lot of them. Go, oh, really? Thanks for telling me that. That's awesome to know. What's a carbohydrate? And see what they say. See if they say, I got to take this phone call. Or if they say, well, those would be polyhydroxyl aldehydes or ketones. If they say that, if they say those are polyhydroxyl aldehydes or ketones, you might want to pay a little bit of attention to what they say after that. Maybe right or wrong, but at least they're somewhat credible that they know what they're talking about. One of the things I'd like to have as an educational goal in this class, and unfortunately it's kind of hard to test you on. I like to be able to set an educational goal, present my material to facilitate your learning that educational goal, then design an exam question that examines whether you got that educational goal or not. This one's kind of hard to do, this educational goal that I'll tell you about. I'd like you guys to kind of have your BS filter. So when someone tells you something, what do we believe? How do we know it's true? When they say carbohydrates are bad for you, what does it even mean, bad? What study have you seen that in? What study that did a placebo where the person thought they were getting the treatment, and another group that did get the treatment, and then they made some measurable thing that they measured to see, and this measurable is what they'd call good or bad, right? That's how we do Science. And even then, if you find one study, sometimes one study doesn't answer a question. It's good to have this study repeated. After these studies are repeated, then that information sometimes winds up in textbooks. Most of the time you could trust what you read in textbook because it's published and it's peer-reviewed. It gets sent out to a bunch of experts in the field. But when can you start to, okay, I'm gonna hang my hat on this. I'm gonna believe. Start to believe when you see the studies, when you see the data. Until then, it's gossip. Until then, it might as well just be some graffiti written on a wall. Okay? So keep that in mind. Especially you guys are becoming healthcare professionals. Some people might rely on your expertise. And if you just quote something you heard over a dinner conversation, my mom's friend's aunt says that goat's milk is good, for example. Right? You don't want to quote that. Look, where's the study? Where's the data? Show me the data. You guys see, what was the movie where they said, show me the money? Yeah. All right, back to this. Carbohydrates, large class of polyhydroxy aldehydes or ketones. Polyhydroxy, more than one OH group, and an aldehyde or ketone. Monosaccharides, also known as simple sugars, are the smallest sugars. They contain between 3 and 7 carbon atoms. Monosaccharides can either be aldoses. If the monosaccharide has an aldehyde group and polyhydroxy, we'd call that an aldose. This is an example of an aldose. Here you have the aldehyde group. There's one hydroxy there. There'll be at least one more somewhere in here. We'll talk about what goes in here in a bit. If the monosaccharide's not an aldose, then it's a ketose. It has the ketone group. Notice the carbonyl in the middle of the chain versus the carbonyl on the end of a chain, aldose versus ketose. So one thing I'd like you to be able to do is if I give you an image like this or like this, you'd be able to distinguish aldose or ketose. In general, we divide carbohydrates into 3 classes based on the size of the molecule. I just mentioned monosaccharides. Those are the smallest. An example of monosaccharide is glucose. This is also known as blood sugar. This is a glucometer. People with diabetes can't get sugar into their cells for various reasons. In type 1 diabetes, their pancreas doesn't make enough insulin or doesn't make insulin at all, which is a hormone that induces cells to start taking in sugar so the cells can get energy. This was the first home diagnostic test marketed, the first time where you could actually do a diagnostic test in your home. And people with diabetes use this. They test their blood sugar. When their blood sugar level's up, they'll take insulin. That's type 1 diabetes. There's another type of diabetes called type 2 diabetes. We'll talk about that in chapter 15. The next class of carbohydrates are called oligosaccharides. They contain between 2 and 10 monosaccharides that are covalently bound together. Later on in this chapter, we'll talk about the nature of that covalent bond that holds the monosaccharides together. Sucrose, table sugar is an example. Sucrose is composed of 2 monosaccharides covalently bonded together. One of them is called glucose and one of them is called fructose. And then when you have more than 10 monosaccharides, you have what's called a polysaccharide, sometimes called a complex carbohydrate. Examples of complex carbohydrates would be starch or cellulose. We're going to concentrate on monosaccharides for a while, and then we'll talk about oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. Just a reminder what they are: polyhydroxy ketones or aldehydes, 3 or more carbons. I have a few examples up here. We talked about glucose. Here is the glucose structure. Notice aldehyde, polyhydroxy. A molecule called ribose, aldehyde, polyhydroxy. Molecule called fructose, ketone, polyhydroxy. Do you think these would be water soluble? Yeah? Why? OH, right. Highly polar bonds, just like water, and these can hydrogen bond to water, vice versa. I would never say, give you this structure and ask you to tell me what the name of that molecule is. That's, if you go into sugar chemistry, you'll acquire that just like you learn the names of your family members and friends. sugars are given common names. I would never give you this name ribose and ask you to draw that. That's some memory stuff. So far, what I'd want you to be able to do is any one of those tell me if it's an aldose or a ketose. Look for the aldehyde or ketone. Those sugars have their own unique naming system based on common names. Here's what I want you to know about naming carbohydrates. Carbohydrates usually end in OSE. Monosaccharides always end in OSE.
Glucose, fructose.
Exactly. Cellulose is a polysaccharide. Sucrose is an oligosaccharide. They end in OSE, but starch doesn't. So carbohydrates usually end in OSE. Monosaccharides always end in OSE. They can be classified by their carbonyl group, like what I mentioned earlier, as an aldose or a ketose. We could also classify them by the number of carbons in the molecule. We call a molecule with 3 carbons a triose. We call a molecule with 4 carbons a tetrose. There are several different monosaccharides that are tetrose. So tetrose kind of describes the class of monosaccharides that contain 4 carbons. What I want you to be able to do is what I'm going to talk about next is combine these two methods and classify, name the carbohydrates by their carbonyl group and the number of carbons. For example, if you have a 3-carbon monosaccharide that has an aldehyde, that would be an aldotriose. If you have a 3-carbon molecule that has a ketone, that would be a ketotriose. Here's a table that summarizes those different ways to name and classify the monosaccharides. The first 2 rows right here, if we're going to classify them by their functional group, it'll be an aldose or ketose. From here to here, if we're going to classify them by the number of carbons, we'd use one of these names. Down here on the bottom, that's where we combine both. We name it based on the functional group and number of carbons. These are just a few examples here. For example, if you have 5 carbons in the molecule and it's an aldehyde, we'd call that an aldopentose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons. Aldehyde, an aldopentose. This looks kind of funny. That's an OH bound to that carbon, an OH bound to that carbon. If you read it backwards, what do you have? Ho, 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 ho. Santa Claus. Here's an example of a ketotetrose. 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons, tetrose, and it has the ketone functional group, a ketotetrose. You guys do that on these 3. If you're watching the video, click pause and work on these problems. Is this one an aldose or a ketose? That one? And that one? Good. Check your answers. Hi, I'm Dr. Jim Zoval. If you like this video and you'd like to get the entire course or just some of the chapters on video, I have the entire course and video lectures at the website you see on the screen right now. They're available on demand. The period of the rental is for a full year, so you'll have this video through the entire course. You could watch it as many times as you want, whenever you want. Happy studies.